Being the first president of the United States, George Washington has many distinctions. Notably, he was the first and one of only two presidents. John Adams was the first president. Thomas Jefferson was the first of 20 presidents. James Madison's mother was still alive by the end of his 8-year presidency, making him the first president. James Monroe was the first of 17 presidents. John Quincy Adams was the first president. However, he wasn't the first president. With a history marred by violence, duels, and war, it might come as no surprise that Andrew Jackson was the first president. Martin Van Buren is the first and only president. There was a photo taken of William Henry Harrison after his inaugural address in 1841. Making him the first president. John Tyler was the first president. James K. Polk was the first president. He died. It was likely cholera that killed him. He was also the first president. In 1848, Zachary Taylor became the first of 5 presidents. Millard Fillmore was the first president. Franklin Pierce delivered his inaugural address from memory, being the first president. James Buchanan was the first president. For over a century and a half, he was the only president. Abraham Lincoln was the first president. Ulysses S. Grant was the first president. James A. Garfield was ambidextrous and the first president, or at least the first known president. Chester A. Arthur was the first president. While he wasn't the first president, Grover Cleveland was the first. Going into his presidency, Cleveland was a bachelor. He was also the first president. Benjamin Harrison was the first president. William McKinley was the first president. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president. William Howard Taft was the first president. Woodrow Wilson is actually the first president. He remains the only president. In 1923, Warren G. Harding became the first president. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first president. It was actually considered unsafe for a president to fly on an airplane, though Roosevelt would make extensive use of flight during his 12-year presidency, allowing him to visit Haiti, Iran, and the Soviet Union. He was also the first president. Harry S. Truman was the first president. Hawaii and Alaska were only admitted into the Union in 1959. Thus, Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president, along with Richard Nixon. John F. Kennedy was the first president. Lyndon B. Johnson was the first president. Gerald Ford was the first and only president. Jimmy Carter was the first president. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became the first president. George H.W. Bush was the first president. Bill Clinton was the first president. George W. Bush was the first president. The official presidential portrait of Barack Obama, taken in 2009, was taken with a digital camera, making him the first president. Donald Trump is the first president. Joe Biden is the first president. To support regular uploads from this channel, consider